Hello, this is Craig Wescoe recording for TCGplayer.com, and today we're going to be playing a modern black-white Gideons deck. So this is a black-white sort of mid-range controlling deck. It's really a control deck. It's sort of a tap-out Planeswalker control style of deck. It's a deck that I played about a year ago and had reasonable amount of success with, and I kind of got away from it and went back to playing sort of Death and Taxes, Hate Bearers style decks. But it was really an evolution from black-white tokens. And one of the things that it does is it basically plays I guess obviously, the more controlling style of play, where you're very reactive. So it plays a lot of Wrath of God effects. It has Lingering Souls, and it has a lot of point removal, and it has discard and it has Planeswalkers. That's basically what the deck is all about. So it's kind of like a hyper-powered standard deck, really. You see these types of Planeswalker control type decks have success in standard, but with modern, there's like so many combo decks and things like that that it's hard to kind of find a build that can compete in modern. But I think we've done it. I think that black white, and I say we've done it. It's been doing well in some Grand Prix and Magic Online. So this is kind of it's my own list, but it's kind of a variation on some of the lists that have been having success lately. So it's a little bit deviation from the one that I made about a year ago. I made a video. You could look back. It's black white control, or Orzhov control, I think is what I called it. Anyway, so the deck plays 3 different Gideons, and it takes advantage of the new semi-new Planeswalker rule that you can play multiple copies of Gideon as long as they have different names. So you play Gideon of the Trials, you play Gideon Ally of Zendikar, and you play Gideon Jorah. And you can have all of them on the battlefield at the same time, which is kind of interesting. You also play Sauron, play Obnixilis, and you play Liliana. Just kind of, why not? They're good in this the style of deck. It's not a Liliana deck, but she's definitely good enough to just play one of. So let's talk about some of the card choices. We have 3 Path to Exile and 3 Fatal Push. Because a lot of decks in this format, you need instant speed interaction to deal with their creatures, and you also need very cheap, efficient removal spells to deal with, like a Goblin Guide, for instance. And so these are the 2 most efficient removal spells in the format. So being black-white gives you that advantage. Another advantage of playing black-white is that you get the cheapest, most efficient hand disruption spells. So you get Inquisition of Kozilek and you get Thoughtseize. So against decks that aren't creature heavy, these are kind of the cards that we lean on pretty heavily to tear apart their hand and give us time to do stuff. Collective Brutality is sort of a cross between Fatal Push and Inquisition of Kozilek. So it's a duress type of effect where you can take an instant or sorcery out of their hand. So against decks that are creature light, that's the mode that we tend to prefer. But then you can also give a creature -2/-2, or against burn you can gain 2 life and deal them 2 damage. Wall of Omens is a card that a lot of decks aren't playing, but I think that it's good in this deck because it protects all of your planeswalkers. And also 25 lands is a lot, but we have a high curve, so if we didn't play the 2 walls, I would be playing 26 lands. But the walls allow us to draw a card, so 25 is about right. And then we also have Lingering Souls. So also Wall of Omen's great against Bloodbraid Elf. That's another thing that makes Wall better right now. Lingering Souls is really good against decks that try to go wide with low toughness creatures that plan to attack. So Affinity, or like Mardu Pyromancer making their own tokens. Or you could just get a couple trump blocks off of, if the opponent has a Tarmogoyf for whatever. These tokens can protect your planeswalkers and allow you to keep generating abilities off of their loyalty abilities without the planeswalkers being threatened by opposing creatures. So that's something really cool with Lingering Souls. And then if you emblem with Gideon Ally of Zendikar, then your Lingering Souls tokens are 2/2s. So that comes up a reasonable amount. we have Gideon of the Trials as a way to act as a kind of a removal spell. You can +1 to target their creature, whatever it is, that's potentially dealing you damage, and it basically nullifies it. But then we already have cards like Fatal Push and Path to Exile, and we have all these wrath effects that we're about to talk about. So we can't really overload too much on removal spells, because then we play against like an Ad Nauseam deck or whatever, and you just have, half the cards in your deck do nothing because they don't have creatures for you to kill. Where that's where something like Gideon of the Trials being played in our deck over like a Dismember or an Oblivion Ring or something is really beneficial, because it's a 4/4 for 3 basically that puts the opponent on a fast clock, and also the emblem can come up. So some decks have difficulty pressuring a Planeswalker, and when you have difficulty pressuring a Planeswalker, then the ultimate can make it really difficult to win the game. So that's why Gideon of the Trials is in the deck. And then Liliana, just a efficient card. If we're playing against a heavy creature deck, we're going to discard cards like Thoughtseize to our Liliana. If we're playing a deck that's creature light, we're going to discard cards like Fatal Push to the Liliana. And it's also a removal spell, minus to kill the creature. Really effective with all these wrath effects. So we have Bantu's Last Reckoning as a 3-mana wrath, Damnation, Wrath of God, Settle the Wreckage, and Day of Judgment. So the reason we have one of all 5 of these instead of like, maybe 2 copies of Wrath of God and 0 copies of Day of Judgment, it's mostly because the Humans deck plays Meddling Mage. It's one deck in the format, but it is a deck that's reasonably common in the metagame. I think it's about 4 to 5% of the metagame, so you'll expect to play against it maybe once in a Grand Prix, or maybe 50% of the time play against it once. So it's a deck you really want to have the right answers for. And the difference between Wrath of God and Day of Judgment, for instance, Day of Judgment is worse because they can regenerate, so it's relevant against Welding Jar and Affinity, but Affinity is already a really good matchup. And it's also relevant against like Thrun the Last Troll, like not much. Like there's very few cases where the cannot be regenerated comes up. So it's better to basically split the difference to protect us against Meddling Mage. So the Meddling Mage, the name Wrath of God, and then we cast Day of Judgment to kill other creatures, or vice versa. So that's basically why we have the split the way we do. And so the other creature is our Planeswalker, Gideon Ally of Zendikar. This is basically our fastest way to apply pressure. So we can just produce blockers or attackers as 2/2s. We can emblem if we have a bunch of Lingering Souls tokens, or what is very often the case, especially against decks that we're racing, we want to just make a 2/2 and then next turn attack with the 2/2 and the 5/5. So we just make him a creature the second time. And so that's a 7 damage a turn, which is pretty potent from a 4-mana spell. And then we have Gideon Jorah, which is basically our way of forcing the opponent to overcommit into our wrath effects, because otherwise he just has to attack Gideon, and that's not going to get them very far because we have a lot of loyalty on Gideon, especially when we have tokens that provide pretty reasonable defense and can trade in combat and things like that. Then we can also minus to kill creatures, tapped creatures. And Ob Nixilis is another removal spell, good follow-up to a Wrath. So we Wrath their board, then they play a follow-up creature, and then we play Ob Nixilis, we minus to kill their creature, and then we can just start upticking to draw cards. So it's kind of our way to draw cards, gain card advantage. Sauron, also a great way of gaining card advantage, just plus it, and also gains us life, and can just slowly kill the opponent. Also an effective way to kill a creature. So let's say if they're a deck with red, they might have Lightning Bolt to give themselves reach. We Wrath their board, then they play in a follow-up creature, and then we play Sauron, and we minus to kill their creature and gain life, and then we can start upticking Sauron. So that's a pretty cool thing we can do with Sauron. And so for the lands, it's like I said, 25. We have 5 colorless lands in the deck. We have the 4 Field of Ruin, which I think most lists run fewer than 4, but I think 4 is a good number. Especially, I changed up the sideboard and I put surgical extractions in there. I think surgical is really good because we have 8 hand disruption spells. So we take their key card, like Escape Shift, for instance, and then we surgical it, and now it's really difficult for them to win. Or we can Field of Ruin their Tron land or their Valakut or something like that, and then surgical it. So that gives us a lot of game against those matchups that are otherwise not very easy, quite difficult in fact. And so then we have a bunch of dual lands. We have Godless Shrine, Fetid Heath, Isolated Chapel, Marsh Flats. We have Shambling Vents, again to gain us some life, and also to pressure the opponent. And we have Vault of the Archangel, which I'm not quite sure if it's correct or not. I've had it kind of help me in some situations and really hurt me that it's colorless in others. It might just be correct to play another black-white dual land instead. But it's pretty useful when you have a bunch of tokens, because it gives the tokens Death Touch, or you can gain some life, get out of burn range in the mid-game. So that's the main deck. And then the sideboard, the sideboards across the different versions have varied pretty widely, including mine. So here we kind of have groups of things that we're doing. So one of the groups of things that we're doing is dealing with the opponent's graveyard. So we have Rest in Peace as the main thing to deal with that. And we also have Grafdigger's Cage. And I made the split because drawing multiple copies of Rest in Peace is kind of, redundant. Whereas a turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage can be very relevant against like Hollow 1, for instance, where turn 2 Rest in Peace, especially in the draw, might just be too late. They might have already, done their thing and got their Bloodghast back and stuff like that. But then also, Grafdigger's Cage has utility against cards like Court of Calling or Collected Company. So it's relevant for other reasons than the Rest in Pieces. It's not just graveyard hate. But then also, the Rest in Peace does stuff that the Grafdigger's Cage doesn't do, such as stopping Gurmag Angler or Living End, because Grafdigger's Cage, the way Living End is wording it, they exile the creatures, then they come in, so they come in from exile instead of the graveyard, which is very counterintuitive, but that's the way the cards are worded. Stony Silence, great against Affinity, Tron, great against this Krark Clan Ironworks deck that Matt Nass and some other players, Shaheen Sarani, are been piloting to success lately. Also good against Lantern, which won the Pro Tour, Luis Salvato. We have Leyline of Sanctity, which is great in this deck until the Planeswalker rule comes into play. So this card probably won't be in our sideboard in a few months after Dominaria is released, because they're changing it where you now, so right now, if I have a Leyline on the board and I have a Planeswalker and the opponent has a Lightning Bolt in their hand, they cannot deal the damage to the Planeswalker, because the way the rules work now, you deal the damage to the opponent and then redirect the damage to the Planeswalker. And so you can't do that when you have Leyline out. They can't bolt us, for instance. But if we have, when the new rules come to play, now the cards are errated, where Bolt says deal 3 damage to a player or Planeswalker. So now, even if we have a Leyline in play, they can still bolt our Planeswalker, but that won't come into play until Dominaria. So for now, we have Leyline. When Dominaria comes out, probably want to replace Leyline with something like Runed Halo. So Leyline, really good against Valakut, really good against Hand Disruption. So against decks that have Thoughtseize and things like that, we don't want them taking our Planeswalkers, so we just protect ourselves from it all with Leyline. And also great against Burn, which is an otherwise not so easy matchup. So we have Leyline, we have Surgical, which can act as graveyard hate in matchups where we want a bunch of it. So against like Reanimator decks, things like that, Dredge. But then it also plays a key role against Tron decks and Valakut decks, because we can Field of Ruin one of their lands and then surgical them off it completely, and then they have to beat us the hard way. And it's also a way to disrupt combo decks that we can use a hand disruption spell and then surgical it, and then they have to kill us without that key combo piece. And then the last sort of chunk is this Fragmentized Disenchant Anguish Unmaking. So against Affinity, they board in the anti-Stony Silence card, the Girapar Ether Grid. And so if we only have Stony, then eventually they'll just grind us out with the Ether Grid, unless we clock them quickly with a Planeswalker. Then they can use Ether Grid to kill our Planeswalker. So it's kind of a necessary evil to have 3 ways to kill an enchantment in our sideboard, or at least in our 75. And then once we do that, I want to diversify a little bit. So Disenchant's great against any sort of artifact or enchantment. Can also be good against Slippery Boggle type decks. Anguish Unmaking comes in as an extra creature removal spell in matchups where we want a ton of creature removal. Can also just deal with any permanent. So it's kind of just a little what would you say? Just some diversity can help a little bit, because some scenarios we want the Fragmentized and the Disenchant, but not the Anguished. Other times we want the Anguished, but not the Fragmentized or the Disenchant. And then having, like Blood Moon can be a problematic card. So some matchups we want the answers to that, things like that. So anyway, this deck, it's a deck that I think is really good when the metagame is filled with creature decks, whether it's like a mid-range Jund type creature deck, or an aggressive like Affinity creature deck, or a Humans creature deck. So the heavier the metagame is toward creatures, the better off this is. And I think with the printing of Bloodbraid Elf, a lot more people are moving toward those decks that play creatures and attack, and this deck is really good against those type of decks. And you also have sideboard cards and hand disruption to give you game against the combo decks. And when we board out all of our creature removal spells against the creature light decks, we want to board in a bunch of cards. So our sideboard is heavily skewed toward non-creature decks, so that we have enough cards to bring in when we want to board out all our removal spells. So let's give this deck a try. White-black Gideons.